We would like to understand the difference between the static frictional force and the kinetic or dynamic frictional force. We know static frictional force exists between the two bodies when the bodies are in the state of rest. If at least any of one body is moving, then the frictional force between them is called as a kinetic friction, or also called like a dynamic friction. Let us try to draw a small graph taking the force that we are applying on the x-axis and how much the friction is developed on the y-axis. As we said in the previous post, static frictional force is self-adjusting force. That means if you have not applied any force, frictional force also becomes 0. If you increase the applied force, we know that the frictional force will be keep on increasing, and we know at a certain stage that will reach its maximum. That maximum frictional force is called as limiting frictional force or maximum static frictional force. Until then, the body is still in the state of rest itself, because applied force is not at all sufficient to overcome the maximum static frictional force. Now, if we have applied a force that is more than the maximum static frictional force, we can imagine that the body comes into the state of motion. Now, as at least one body is in the state of motion, there is no that much of the interlocking between the surfaces. That means there is no sufficient time for one body to get interlocked with the irregular surface of the other body, because they are moving. So, as there is no that much of the interlocking, kinetic friction will be less. So, you can imagine, you can identify that there is a fall of the frictional force, and it will further continue like this. This is called as something like static friction, the first part. This could be called like a dynamic friction. So, we can understand that dynamic friction is little bit less than that of the static frictional force. To measure the static frictional force, we use a coefficient called mu s, coefficient of static friction. To understand the dynamic frictional force, we can write Fk equal to mu k into n. This is also a coefficient of friction, but this is called kinetic coefficient of friction or dynamic coefficient of friction. From this, it is very clear that coefficient of kinetic friction or dynamic friction is always less than that of the static frictional force. Because the frictional force is less, friction is measured with this coefficient of friction. So, we can say kinetic frictional force, correspondingly coefficient of kinetic friction is less than that of the static frictional force. If suppose you are rolling one body over the other body, then of course the bodies are in the state of motion. It is a kind of a dynamic friction, but it has one more advantage, that because one body is rolling over the other body, we can see the point of contact is much less, because the surfaces themselves that are in contact are less, therefore interlocking is less, corresponding frictional force also is going to be less. That kind of a friction could be called like rolling friction. We can measure that with a coefficient called coefficient of rolling friction. From all this discussion, it might be clear that rolling friction is even less than that of the kinetic friction. So, we can conclude that among all the frictions, rolling friction is the lowest friction, kinetic friction is little bit more than that, and the static friction is even more than that. That is why we always prefer to roll the bodies. Consider a car, vehicle, any vehicle that you see, all their wheels are rolling. Have you ever seen a costly car with a square shaped wheel? No, it does not happen. So, you buy the car with much bigger money, but still it shall have a wheel, it shall not have another shape, because the wheel has to roll, therefore the friction has to be less, therefore journey will be more comfortable, right. Therefore, the conclusion is there are three types of frictions called as static friction, kinetic friction, and there is another friction called rolling friction. Among all the frictions, rolling friction is the least frictional force which is opposing the relative motion.